Hi, folks. All right, so as promised, in this recorded lecture, we are going to go over the chapter on stimulants. Get those slides pulled up for you guys here. All right, so as I mentioned, we are talking about chapter 12, which covers the topic of stimulants. We'll jump right in. So this is a category of psychomotor stimulants are a category of drug that increase activity of the central nervous system and also of motor activity as well, which is why these substances are sometimes referred to as psychomotor stimulants. Some of the drugs that are more well known in this category, of course, caffeine, which had its own chapter in your textbook, but in this chapter, we'll be talking specifically about cocaine, the amphetamines, methamphetamine, its cousin, Ritalin, the cathinones. And of course, there are a lot of different slang terms for these substances depending upon the substance that we're talking about, from coke to blow, crack, and ice, etc. And again, we're talking about substances here that increase the activity of the central nervous system. And we'll talk a little bit more about the neurological underpinnings of that in a couple of slides here. The history of cocaine use begins with the coca shrub. It is grown in South America in the Andes Mountains of Peru and Bolivia. The leaves contain about 2% cocaine and are chewed for their effect. This can be traced back to the Inca civilization, which regard coca as a gift from the god Inti to the Incas, a traditional belief that had lasted for 5 millennia. When the Spaniards conquered the Incas in 1532, the coca leaves were brought back to Europe, but after the long sea voyage, they lost their potency. Coca leaves were ignored by the West for the next 300 years. However, in 1859, German chemist Alfred Niemann noticed the active ingredient of the coca plant produced a numbing effect when placed on his tongue. He named it cocaine. In 1863, Angelo Mariani in Corsica mixed coca and wine, which he distributed as Vin Mariani. The alcohol gave the cocaine a longer half-life, up to 5 times longer than cocaine alone. Mariani secured endorsements from customers like President William McKinley, Thomas Edison, General Ulysses S. Grant, actress Sarah Bernhardt, Jules Verne, and even Pope Pius X, thereby inventing the celebrity endorsement. In the US, Georgia pharmacist John Pemberton created French wine cola, in imitation of Vin Mariani. In deference to the temperance movement, he took out the alcohol, made a few other changes, and in 1885, Coca-Cola was born. It was advertised for its medicinal value, a stimulating brain tonic, a remedy for nervous ailments like headaches and melancholia. This may be why soda fountains were put in drugstores. It began to get nicknames like Carr Cola, Dope Cola, Cola Aid, and Wise Ola. By the beginning of the 20th century, the patent medicine industry was marketing more than 50,000 unregulated products like cocaine toothache drops. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 helped to solve the problem. Bowing to pressure from proponents of Jim Crow who believed cocaine made African Americans powerful and uncontrollable, Coca-Cola changed their formula in 1903, retaining the coca flavor but eliminating the cocaine itself. They continued to buy the coca leaves from Peru until the 1960s when, fearing the crackdown on international cocaine trade, they convinced the government to raise the coca in Kauai until a fungus wiped out the crop. Today, the process of removing cocaine from high-grade coca leaves is the responsibility of the Stepan Company in New Jersey. They are the only company in the country which receives coca leaf shipments from Peru, separate the cocaine chemically, and produce high-quality cocaine. They shipped the remainder of the coca leaves to the Coca-Cola company as part of its secret recipe. And the cocaine is sold legitimately to be used as a local anesthetic. Any excess cocaine is produced, any excess cocaine produced is destroyed under the watchful eye of the government. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act imposed severe restrictions upon the distribution of opium and cocaine products. In 1884, Sigmund Freud, after reading reports from a German physician on the effects of cocaine on soldiers, tried cocaine and found the experience to be exhilarating, as he called it. He distributed the drug to his friends, his sisters, and even his fiancée, Martha Bernays. He was so convinced that cocaine was an important medicinal drug that could cure morphine dependence and depression that he wrote a small pamphlet on the topic entitled Über Coca, which translated into English means concerning coca, and had it published in medical journals. It was also published as the Cocaine Papers. Freud escaped a long-term addiction to the drug ultimately, but many of his friends that he turned on to the substance, including Dr. Ernst von Fleischl-Markau, were not so lucky. Freud gave Dr. von Fleischl-Markau cocaine to break his morphine addiction, and which was a common problem in the 1800s. Within a year, his colleague had increased his dose to 20 times the amount that Freud had ever taken, and he began to have cocaine-induced psychosis that produced hallucinations and other nasty side effects, like the feeling of snakes crawling all over his skin. He ultimately died of his addiction 6 years after he began using the substance, died of cocaine overdose, which was one of Freud's really big regrets. And in 1887, he published a retraction on the dangers of cocaine, which was basically a retraction of his previous work, Über Coca. But Freud was very well known as having been a proponent of cocaine, at least early in his career. Amphetamines are short-acting stimulant drugs that work to increase wakefulness in the user. Amphetamines have their origin in the Chinese medicinal herb called mua hang, or Ephedra vulgaris. It was used to clear bronchial passageways. Chinese legend says that it was first identified by Emperor Shen Nung, who also discovered tea and cannabis. The main ingredient, ephedrine, was isolated by a German chemist in 1887. Observing its stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, a synthetic form was developed in 1932 by SmithKline Pharmaceutical Company, and French laboratories marketed it under the name Benzedrine, which is ultimately an amphetamine drug. Amphetamines were used by pilots during World War II to keep them awake and alert. Its advantages over cocaine were obvious. After the war, these drugs were used by college students and long-distance truck drivers to stay awake and fight fatigue. Amphetamine is also known as the brand name drug Adderall. For those of you who did not know, Adderall is actually amphetamine. Amphetamine is effective as a general arousing agent, and it has antidepressant effects on mood. It will definitely suppress appetite, and it'll keep people awake for long periods of time. Like I said, these days it's mainly used as a treatment for ADHD. During the early 1960s, amphetamines were bought with forged prescriptions, and people even began shooting it up even as early as the 60s. And again, even to this day, Adderall is probably one of the most popular amphetamines that you can get a prescription for, and fetches a nice little price on the black market, particularly among college students who are trying to stay awake and cram for exams. Amphetamines and methamphetamine share many similarities. Think of them as chemical cousins. When comparing amphetamine versus methamphetamine, both have a high risk of addiction, but offer medical use applications. They produce many of the same side effects. However, meth is more potent and fast acting. And typically these days, most of the meth that exists is not chemically pure. It's made in people's basements through household cleaning supplies and is highly unsafe to use. Uh, and again, methamphetamines are more harmful than amphetamines, not only because of the impurities that can end up in them, but methamphetamine enters the brain more quickly than amphetamines do. And methamphetamines in particular have been linked to tooth decay and a general deterioration of health that can be quite rapid in people who begin to use meth. If you look online at some of these before and after pictures of people who began to use meth, you can see what I'm talking about. So here in this table, you can see a quick and easy little information uh, piece on the drugs that we've been talking about and a couple more that we have not yet talked about, but that shows their administration, different routes of administration into the body. And again, I would also be sure to read these chapters in your textbook. Stimulants are used to increase attention and delay sleep. They originally were popular with pilots and, like I said, later with truck drivers. They are used medically to treat ADHD. Your textbook mistakenly calls it ADD. That is an outdated term. It's called ADHD these days. And these drugs are also often used to treat narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder that causes people to fall asleep uncontrollably. Uh, so Freud famously stated that the aim of stimulants was to, quote, increase the physical capacity of the body for a given short period of time. However, stimulants also produce euphoria and a sense of well-being, which are elements of addiction. So most stimulant substances, even caffeine, really is mildly addictive. And definitely cocaine and methamphetamine, these substances are highly addictive substances, mainly because of the effects that they have on your dopamine system. Which brings us to the topic of monoamine neurotransmitters. Monoamine neurotransmitters are the group of neurotransmitters which regulate euphoria, blood pressure, appetite, and attention. They include serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Uh, and psychomotor, actually, serotonin is actually not among the, I misspoke. The the catecholamine drugs are the ones that that have the stimulating effect. And yeah, so we're talking about monoamines and catecholamines. I apologize for misspeaking, folks. Sometimes I get my wires crossed. So you have your monoamine neurotransmitters, which do include serotonin, and then you have a subcategory of these drugs that are called catecholamines, which include dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And it's particularly dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine that you're going to see the largest amount of stimulation of with these stimulant drugs, particularly drugs like amphetamine, drugs like cocaine. These drugs cause a significant amount of dopamine and norepinephrine release. And they do affect the serotonin systems as well. But I would say primarily these drugs have most of their psychoactive effect through affecting the catecholamines, which are norepinephrine, dopamine, and epinephrine. So again, these are drugs that increase activity of the central nervous system. They're going to increase the activity of what we call specifically your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system that is responsible for your ability to respond to threats, right? So anything that increases the activity of your sympathetic nervous system is going to cause increases in blood pressure, heart rate, constriction of blood vessels, dilation of your bronchioles. And in extreme cases, these substances can have quite negative effects on your heart and cardiovascular system and have not, it's not unheard of to hear people have heart attacks when they're on cocaine or on amphetamine drugs. This is why if you get a prescription for Adderall from a doctor, most doctors, if they're being responsible, will have you do a heart checkup every so often just to make sure that the drug isn't having a negative effect on your heart health. So there's no question that stimulants improve attention for formal use in ADHD treatment and as well as just in anyone, really. You don't have to have ADHD for these drugs to improve attention. And again, that's why they're commonly abused among a lot of college students who are trying to stay awake for long periods of time. You hear about these drugs getting abused a lot, particularly among grad students and medical school students. But human imaging studies show that attention is located in the prefrontal cortex, the same area that's active when we process emotions. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding the diagnosis of ADHD, whether or not we're overdiagnosing it in children. That's kind of a separate conversation for another day. But there is no question that these drugs will improve attention in just about anybody, whether you're diagnosed with ADHD or not. In the late 1980s, there was a focus on, quote, crack babies. These were babies born to women who were using crack cocaine during pregnancy. Prenatally, the fetus could have a stroke, and cocaine use is associated with separation of the placenta from the uterus, cutting off the blood supply to the fetus and resulting in brain damage or death. These newborns exhibited lower birth weights, smaller head circumferences, tremors, and excessive crying, and also disturbed sleep patterns and diminished responsiveness to stimuli. Boys seemed to be more affected than girls. The problem was, though, that most of the mothers in this study used lots of different drugs, more than just crack, right? Including alcohol, cannabis, tobacco. They used all kinds of drugs, right? So it was really impossible to say whether it was the crack that was causing these particular symptoms or, all the drugs that these women were taking, combined, right? So we have confound factors, is what we would call this, confound variables from a scientific standpoint that kind of make it impossible to say for sure that it was just the crack alone that caused these symptoms or, kind of the whole plethora of drugs that these women were on while pregnant. Uh, so a few more things to touch on before we get to the end of this chapter. A little bit on animal research on addiction to stimulants. Animals will press a lever hundreds of times to get a single intravenous dose of cocaine. They will not voluntarily ingest dangerous amounts of alcohol or nicotine or alcohol or nicotine. Heroin will follow a similar pattern to cocaine use. If monkeys are restricted in their use of cocaine to a few hours a day, they will not reach toxic levels and intake will remain stable. Individuals who use stimulants only while engaged in a particular task or environment, like truck drivers and college students, will abstain when in a different environment. Dopaminergic neurons can be seen as substituting as for drugs for natural reinforcers when it comes to addictive behaviors like sex or gambling, right? So it's, these dopamine's the same neurotransmitter that's basically involved in all addictive processes, but we see pronounced dopamine release, particularly when it comes to stimulant use. Tolerance will build to the effects of stimulants and particularly like appetite suppression. You will develop a tolerance. Your appetite won't be as suppressed with repeated use. You'll need more and more of the substance to get the same effect. But the good news is that withdrawal from stimulants tends to not be life-threatening for most people. All right, so I'm going to direct you guys to make sure that you guys fully uh, educate yourselves by reading the chapter again. The chapter on stimulants is chapter 12, and make sure that you read everything that your textbook has to say on this topic. It's also important to be familiar with some of these diagnostic criteria that I have in some of these slides for you guys. So take a look at these and familiarize yourself with these following diagnostic criteria, including the criteria for stimulant intoxication, stimulant withdrawal, and stimulant use disorder. It might also be helpful to take a look at some of our local laws and penalties here in the state of Florida, where I am recording my lecture. For those of you who are watching from outside of the state of Florida, this will be less relevant to you. But it's always a good idea to be familiar with your local laws and regulations. All right, so I hope that this recorded lecture on the topic of stimulants was helpful to you all, considering that we had a technical issue that caused us to have to skip this topic during our live class meeting. So I look forward to seeing you all during our next live class meeting. And for those of you who are just watching on YouTube who aren't my students, thank you for checking out my YouTube station. You might anticipate seeing some more of these lectures come out on this station sporadically in the future, but I'm not on any particular schedule, so we'll see what the future holds for this station.